everybody, Charles for HumbleMechanics.com. Today, we're talking about the top 5 failures of the B5 and B5.5 Passat. So next up in the top 5 most common failures series, we're going to be talking about the B5 and B5.5 Passat. This is 1998 to 2005 Volkswagen Passat 1.8 turbo, V6, W8, and the TDI. Now, before we get into this show, I gotta tell you guys, I drive one of these cars. I love this car. To me, this is one of the best driving Volkswagens that's ever been on the road. So some of this comes from a point of a technician where I've put a lot of these parts on these cars, and the other comes from an enthusiast and a daily driver of one of these vehicles. I love this generation car for a lot of reasons, and we're gonna get into all of that today. But before we get into the show, let's talk about the sponsor of the day, which is Deutsch Auto Parts. These guys are the Volkswagen Audi parts experts. In fact, the last time I did a CV boot on my Passat, I called Paul at Deutsch Auto Parts and asked him for what the part number is supposed to be on my car. There's a little bit of weirdness in the Volkswagen parts catalog, so I picked up the phone, called Paul, and he helped me through it. These guys have awesome service, great pricing, a ton of really great DIY videos, so check them out at shop.dap.com. All right, so the B5 Passat is probably one of the most expensive Volkswagens to maintain. It has a whole laundry list of problems that sort of started in 1998 and carried all the way through to really even today. Let's get into what some of these are. Now, these are only the top 5. There are some other issues. And just because I talk about this problem today doesn't mean you're going to have this issue with your Passat. Number 1, oil leaks. This was really common on the 1.8 turbo and the V6. Valve cover gaskets, cam adjuster gaskets, cam plugs, cam seals. Basically from top to bottom, these engines were really known to leak oil. And the good thing from a technician standpoint is these were gravy jobs. These were jobs that paid 3, 4, 5 hours that you could get done in 40 minutes. Now, from a customer standpoint, these were terrible because it was expensive to fix these oil leaks, and it happened a lot. My 1.8 turbo Passat sitting right outside in the driveway has got a bit of seepage from the valve cover gasket that I need to take care of. In fact, these oil leaks were 1, so common, and 2, such good work that guys were upselling these repairs under warranty, which is a huge no-no in the automotive world. We actually had to get our service manager to sign off on making this repair because guys would see a little tiny bit of oil and say, hey, look, this gasket's leaking oil. And there was like yay much oil leaking from the valve cover gasket. So this was a really common thing. Even today, as these cars age up and up and up, these oil leaks are still common. So again, valve cover gaskets, cam adjuster gaskets, cam seals, cam plugs, oil pump gasket, oil pan gaskets, even upper oil pan gaskets on the V6, all very common to leak and really all gravy work. Number 2, water leaks. And I don't mean coolant leaks, I mean actually water leaking into the inside of the vehicle. There were 2 main causes of water leaks. Number 1 was clogged sunroof drains. This is where debris would get in the sunroof drains, it would clog the bottom of the drain, back up, and either leak water onto the headliner, or what was really more common is leak water into the floorboard. What a lot of people don't know is the metal portion of the floor of the vehicle was about 3 inches lower than the top of the carpet, so you could have several inches of water standing underneath the carpet before you ever saw water on top of the carpet. This was a bad thing all on its own. You know, the smell, the mold, the mildew, you name it. I've seen mushrooms growing in cars because of water leaks. But what made this whole problem even worse is the fact that Volkswagen had 2 modules underneath the front floorboards. On the driver's side, you had the convenience module. On the passenger side, you had the transmission control module. It was not uncommon to have these modules completely submerged. You'd take the waterproof box out from under the carpet and just pour water out of it. The other bad thing about these modules is they were big connectors. They were 30 and 40 wire connectors. So let's say you got a bunch of water underneath the carpet. Not only would you have to replace the module, you would have to repin all of those wires. So you're talking 30, 40 wire repins on some of these cars. It was a big job. Honestly, it was a job I loved to do. You know, you could just get all your wiring repair stuff, sit on the floor and kind of make these repairs. Everybody would leave you alone because they would see a giant stack of wire ends and not want anything to do with what you were doing. So it was actually really nice and kind of therapeutic just to sit and make this repair. But a lot like oil leaks, the bad part is this was really expensive. You're talking several $100s for replacement of the module, not to mention drying the carpet, getting all the water out, plus repinning 30 or 40 wires on anything on a vehicle can get really expensive. And in the worst case scenario, I've actually had 2 cars totaled because of these water leaks. You'd have corrosion feet into the harness to the point where making a repair wasn't really the best choice. And unfortunately, at that point, you had to replace the body harness, which is basically from taillights to headlights, all the wires in between, gutting the entire interior of the car. It was a huge job, so I did have multiple Passats totaled because of water leaks. Number 3, suspension failures. These Passats were equipped with a 4-link suspension. So that meant there was 4 links connecting the vehicle to basically the knuckle. So you had 2 upper control arms, 2 lower control arms, and a tie rod, which technically I guess is a 5-link suspension, not a 4-link. But these links had failures at multiple points. The most common were upper link failures, whether it was on the inner portion where the bushing is or the outer portion where the ball joint was. You would get failures on either side. And while the lower links were less common to fail, they still failed as well. And the tie rods were also a really common point of failure. In fact, I think Volkswagen had a recall not only on the tie rods on the early ones, they had a recall on one of the lower control arms as well. The bad part about it is not only were these links really expensive, I think now they're like $140 each for the upper, and I think the lowers are even over $200 now from the dealership. The labor was high, it was a big job, it was basically disassembling the front suspension. And to top all of that off, you had to pay for a really expensive alignment. Those cars had not only a front alignment, which was, toe, camber, and caster, it had a raised toe alignment, which means we changed the height of the tie rod in relation to the steering knuckle. So not only did you have expensive components, expensive labor, you had to pay a lot to get the alignment done to do it properly. These failures could result in anything from a clunk in the suspension to, when it was cold, if you cut the wheel all the way, it popped. It popped a lot like a failing CV axle would. I'm sure there's plenty of guys that put axles in these cars for failing upper control arm bushing. This is one of those jobs that was great when you sold it, but it was really uncommon because it was just so expensive to replace these parts. Number 4, and probably the one that's most common on the 1.8 turbo, but still I saw on a few other vehicles, is oil sludge. These cars had 5,000 mile service intervals, and early on, they actually weren't requiring synthetic oil on the 1.8 turbo Passat. So you had conventional oil on a little bit longer service interval. Remember that people are really bad for the most part about maintaining their cars, so they would push it to 6,000 and 7,000, and the oil was just breaking down. In fact, Volkswagen upgraded the size of the oil filter from the little B, which is small, to the big B, which is quite a bit bigger, in order to get more capacity in the crankcase. On top of that, they had kind of weird, weak PCV systems. So you had poor PCV, not enough oil, not synthetic oil, and poor maintenance, all resulted in oil sludge. In fact, Volkswagen had a repair extension on fixing the sludge on these cars. You had to provide your service records, and we would basically take the pan down, put a new oil pickup, flush all the junk out, and put a new PCV system on it in an attempt to salvage the engine. And we were really successful at doing this. I think only 2 or 3 really needed to have engine replacements. All the rest of them we were able to salvage the engine by doing the cleaning service, replacing the pickup, and putting a new crank vent system on. The thing is, a lot of this could have really been avoided by good maintenance. I do the oil change on my car every 4,000 miles. I can tell you there's very little to no sludge at 140-something thousand miles that I have on my 1.8 turbo Passat. But again, people are really bad about maintaining their car overall, coupled with all the other issues that the engine had, and it led to oil sludge problems. And number 5 is premature rear brake wear. It was really common from 20,000 to 30,000 miles on that generation Passat for a vehicle to need rear brakes. In addition to wearing the pads really fast, the rotors are really thin on this generation, so it's not like you could resurface the rotors, put new pads, and send the customer down the road. For the most part, you were having to put rear rotors on the car as well, so high-priced pads, high-priced rotors made for a really expensive brake job at a very low mileage. Now, partially I think this was a driver issue, because I had 70,000 miles on my Passat before I put rear pads on it, and I probably could have got another 10,000 miles. When it comes to brakes, I don't like to push it to the very last mile. I like to go ahead and get these things taken care of so I don't run any risk of failure. But that goes to show you that there's a huge discrepancy between a car that needs brakes at 20,000 and a car that needs brakes at 70,000. This could have been that other drivers were really heavy in the brakes, causing the rear brakes to wear, or the opposite of that. They were light on the brake and rode the brake a lot longer than, let's say, I do. So either way, this was another one of those things that could really heavily be influenced by the driver of the vehicle. All right, guys, that was your top 5 most common failures on the B5 and 5.5 Passat, but there was plenty other things wrong with these cars. There was a bunch of recalls and a bunch of really common other failures. I tried to leave the things that were really common to the Jetta that we've already talked about, the Mark IV Jetta, off this list. So I'm going to run down the recalls really quick, rapid fire style. You had brake light switches, ignition coils, seat heater recalls, the heat shield recall, leaking gas tanks, and resurfacing the pollen filter housing, in addition to a ton of software updates to correct things like cold start misfires. In addition to those recalls, there was also, again, a bunch of other common failures, kind of common across the Volkswagen line. You had ECTs, purge valves, axle boots, engine mounts leaking oil, door latches, rear window regulators failing. Again, cold start misfires were a huge thing, especially on the 1.8 turbos. Broken vacuum lines, light bulbs going out. This really was one of the most repair-heavy Volkswagens that's been on the road since I've been working on Volkswagens. Now, all that being said, again, I drive one of these cars. I absolutely love this car. It's a car that I've owned longer than any other car I've ever had in my entire life. So that should say something about how I feel about the B5, B5.5 Passat. All right, guys, I'm gonna wrap it up there. You know, it's really fun to relive some of these issues on these older vehicles. This generation is what I started working on. It was new technology when I got into the dealership, so it's always fun to look back and see, hey, remember when all this stuff was an issue? So it'll be fun in a few years to kind of look back on what the Mark 6 and Mark 7s are having issues with now. So if you like the video, throw it a thumbs up on YouTube. I always appreciate that. You can also subscribe on YouTube or on the blog at humblemechanic.com. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the blog, and obviously here on YouTube. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Beer of the day is actually not beer. It is the tail end of a gin and tonic.